Sociologists who study the body are also concerned with how we control populations around the world. And so we really need to look at the micro and the macro when we're discussing population and how it's controlled, both at the individual level and at the structural level. We oftentimes think that the decision to have a child or not is a very personal decision. But if we step back from that individual point of view, we can see how the structures of society also contribute to that individual choice. Now, Brian Turner emphasizes the importance of thinking of our bodies in terms of the individual and in terms of populations. And so again, we see that connection between the micro and the macro. Our desire to look at decisions from one particular point of view, I've made that choice on my own, or I was forced into that choice by the structure, is oftentimes how we think. But we need to be encouraged to look at situations from both our individual decision-making ability and the ability of the structure to influence that decision. And so here Turner shows us how the structure can impact the individual. There are two things that he wants us to make sure we understand with regard to populations. They must be reproduced over time, and they must be regulated in space. How much physical space do you have to support those children or those individuals in that society? And so Turner suggests that bodies must be internally and externally regulated. I have to make decisions about reproduction and my body, and my government has to make some choices that may encourage or deter my decisions about fertility. So if we look at population control and issues related to fertility from an internal and external point of view, we see that internal restraint involves having discipline regarding our personal sexual desires, when to do it and when not to do it. It also has to do with how we internalize appropriate cultural representations of sexuality, of fertility, of childbearing. It involves the family. How does our family socialize us? It involves the state. What does our government say about reproduction? It involves the church. What does our faith, our religion, tell us about the use of birth control? What does the church tell us about reproduction in general? It involves our peers. What are the messages we get from our friends? And it certainly, in the United States, involves the media. What are we watching on TV? And what does that tell us about appropriate behaviors? So all of these things together help us to have some sort of internal restraint, we hope, with regard to our sexual behaviors. External regulation is our macro level. This involves how social norms about fertility and sexual regulation are presented to us. It involves the social control of fertility. Is contraception available? Or do we as a country place an emphasis on reproductive technology to help us have more children? This also involves the teaching of restraint for the good of social order. For example, we do not run around having sex in public places. Society doesn't permit that. And so we learn these messages about what's appropriate and inappropriate in public places, in private places, from the macro level structures of society. So now we're talking about America right now. Our society has shifted from an emphasis on internal restraint to one of external regulation. While we still have the family and the state and the church and our peers and the media telling us what to do or what not to do, the state has also taken an active role now in our fertility, hence a solid role in population control. We've shifted since the time of the Industrial Revolution, where before decisions about fertility were individual and made inside the family. We didn't have these large urban centers where lots of people lived together. Now we can see our government taking an active role in our decisions to have children. And we can see this external regulation in play. Because of insurance regulations, up until about the past year, women have always had to pay for birth control, whether that was pills or the diaphragm or the IUD, whichever form she chooses. That has been something that a woman has had to shell out money to get. Now, with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, insurance is being pressured to reduce those costs so that birth control is not something that a woman will have to pay for. And why is this an issue that the state needs to be concerned with? Well, if we want to control our population, then we have to have a way for women to easily regulate their fertility. And if you can't afford to shell out money every month to get that form of birth control that you desire, then you're going to go without. And this could definitely increase the fertility rate in a given society. We also note that in industrialized countries, there are incentives in many of these countries at the government level to encourage you to have children. In non-industrialized countries, there are incentives at the government level to encourage you not to have children. And so we really should think about the implications at the structural level of population on society. What are the implications of low and high fertility? Well, we have personal choices that we make with regard to fertility. For example, we decide to have a child or not, and we think about that decision to have a child as a very personal decision. But that decision is influenced by external factors. What we know about fertility is, as countries industrialize, and the longer they are around, fertility rates for a given country decline. What does that mean? All right, so what is 2.1? All right, 2.1 is the population replacement rate. That means in any given society, every single woman who is fertile must have 2.1 children. Now, what does it mean to be a fertile woman? Well, countries have defined that as a woman between the ages of 15 and 49. So any woman between those ages during that time in her life, between the ages of 15 and 49, must have 2.1 children in order for a population to remain stable. That means when I get married, I have to have one child to replace myself, one child to replace my husband. The 0.1 comes from all the children in any given society who die before they reach adulthood. So I have to cover for those kids who don't grow up to be adults. Now, I think about this in terms of being a very personal choice, but the government has a stake in my reproduction. The government needs to have enough workers to do the jobs that are out there in society. And so if I don't have 2.1 children, and most of my peers, the women in my age group, choose not to have 2.1 children, the overall population for my society starts to decrease. And it decreases in a very negative way. Our population starts to get older because we have less and less and less young children. And because we have medical technology that allows us to live longer, our population begins to gray. And so while I think about this decision about having children as a very personal choice, the government's got a real stake in that decision for me. Now, many industrialized and post-industrialized countries are experiencing fertility issues, population control issues. The United States has just dipped under that 2.1. We're at about 1.7 right now. So we're okay for now. But as we continue to age as a country, that number will continue to decrease. We've seen it in every country in the West. We've seen it in Japan. We've seen it in Canada. We've seen it in Australia. These numbers just continue to drop. What does that mean? Well, that means eventually that country is going to start decreasing in population size unless they have healthy immigration. And they're going to have less tax money going into the government because less people are working. They don't have as many people to fill those jobs when workers retire. So the government does need to get involved with regard to those decisions we make. Can they change my mind? Well, that's the big question. And so far, there hasn't been really any effective government policy in any country to influence that population replacement rate turning around and starting to get higher again. Likewise, in countries that aren't industrialized, we see very high fertility. Countries that haven't yet industrialized have fertility rates in the 4, 5, and 6 range. Women have more children. Those countries also have a stake in regulating population. They would prefer not to have as many children because it's a strain on the country as it tries to build up its infrastructure, as it tries to industrialize. And so in those countries, we might find regulations in place that try to discourage women from having children. And have those government regulations been successful? Again, the answer is no. You can't change an individual's mind, especially when it comes to issues related to fertility and sexual regulation, by government policy. That's a very, very challenging thing to do. So we can see how the sociology of the body really has helped us to explore and explain this previously hidden facet of society. All right, I hope this helps. Take care.